Look, at Hardee's, we think that if you're hungry and you have $5, you deserve a satisfying meal. Like one of our new $5 All-Star meals, loaded with American classics like a charbroiled double cheeseburger, hot dog, fries, drink, even a warm cookie. But hey, if that's not your thing, you can always break out your degree in menu engineering, piece something together from the other guy's value menu. Or just swing by Hardee's, get yourself a real meal. The $5 All-Star meals. There's no better way to spend $5. Price and participation may vary. Prices higher in Alaska and Hawaii. Tax not included.
Welcome to the Church of Mavis radio show. It's Friday night, 7:07 p.m. Central. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Just three things to plug really quick. I got Jay here with us tonight. How's it going, Jay?
Going pretty good. I got a bit of a cold, so I might sound a little like Barry White, but I'll get through it.
That's all right. Here we go. Let me do my plugs. AsianTeaIsKratom.com. Asian tea is used by people all over from everything from pain relief to anxiety to sleep or get energy. It's 100% organic. Product has not been evaluated by the FDA. It's not intended to treat, cure, diagnose any disease or illness. Life is better on Taunton Bay. That's AsianTeaIsKratom.com. UFOCongress.com. 2018, February 14th through the 18th. They'll be doing their situation, their convention, and they have all their guests online now in a big database. It's kind of like a UFO Netflix. You just go there and you pay it's not a bad price, but you can go and watch whenever you want. I've been there watching a lot of the American Indian UFO stuff. There's a few there. Let me see. OzarkUFOConference.com. That's April 13th to the 15th, 2018. Best Western Inn of the Ozarks Convention Center, Eureka Springs, Arizona. That's OzarkUFOConference.com or OzarkUFO.com. And that's a great conference. And also they put their guests on DVD, so good to watch at home. I got a bunch of those. Let me see, what else? Let me just read up some. We only got about a few more guests until we take our break. Let me find my future guests and read those out real quick. Let me see. Oh, let me see here. Oh, that's 2018.
That's coming up, though. We're close.
Yep, you got that right. Let me see. Okay, next Friday, Paul and Ben Eno. Behind the Paranormal. November 17th, Chris Hardy, that's Anunnaki stuff. December 1st, Jim Miles. It's a book from Schiffer about Georgia UFO cases, so I'm interested in getting to those because I'm from Georgia. I'm sure it's a pretty good book, so we'll be getting into some weird UFO cases in Georgia. December 8th, that's our last show. Rich Newman, Ghosts of the Civil War. So that'll be December 8th. And then we take a break to, I believe, January 12th. I got to refuel the fire. And then next year will be year 8. That's 8 years with Joe Montaldo. I should get some kind of award for that. JoJo, that's right. Some kind of award supreme. That's 8 years. My God, that's like prison. All right. Well, that's the rest of the guests. Let me see. Let me just a little peek of who I've been scheduling for next year, just real quick. Let me find that again. I lose everything. Here they go. There it is. So far, let me see. You got Matt Swain, Ghost of Country Music. Kirsten Paget, that's an OCD book. Stephen A. LaChance, The True Story of The Exorcist, the real situation that happened that inspired all that. So that's just a few of the guests coming up that I've been scheduling for next year. Tonight's guest, Nick Redfern, Shapeshifters, Morphing Monsters and Changing Cryptids. and that's from Lillywin Books. We've had a lot of Lillywin guests on lately. It's been great. How you doing, Nick? Good to have you here.
Hey guys, I'm doing good, thanks.
Good to have you back. And also, I know that Slender Man book, I believe your publicist hooked that up because I have it down. She told you about that right in March, I believe it is. Yeah, March.
Yeah, the book actually comes out sometime in February, but by the time copies go out and whatever, yeah, March would be a good time because that'll be right at the start of it also.
Yeah, I got you for the 16th, 8 p.m. Eastern there. Hopefully she brought that up with you, but that's what she told me.
Yeah, she did. I've already got it marked down. So.
All right, just making sure. We'll get into some Slender Man for sure. First off, I wanted to ask you, Nick, did you see that show, Lore, yet on Amazon? Are you familiar with that at all? The Lore, L-O-R-E?
Lore?
It's just called Lore. It was
no, I've not heard of that, no.
Yeah, apparently it was a podcast called Lore by Aaron Mahnke, and then Amazon made it into a series.
Okay.
And what it is, it's like a 6-episode series, but they're weird. They're like little documentaries, but they're also actors, and they get into the origins of like lycanthropy, vampire type stuff. There's a whole one about the guy that invented the lobotomy, which that was insane. Like this guy was just going around doing lobotomies everywhere like a spree killer. But I also just got the book that he put out. You should check it out though, because I know you would love it. But he also put out Monstrous Creatures by Aaron Mahnke, Lore. But yeah, they're really good. Yes, L-O-R-E. And well, the reason why I thought Lore in your book is because in Lore there's a weird story where this, I guess it's in Irish times, I forget what year, but a long damn time ago. And anyway, this Irish husband thinks his wife has been possessed by a changeling fairy, and it gets into this whole like it does a documentary, and then it'll do like an acting scene. What is the guy's name? Robert Patrick, the guy that was in Terminator. He's in some of them, so they're really good. But the reason why I thought it was because I know you get into shapeshifters, of course, in your book, Shapeshifters, and also you get into like, you know, the fairy lore and, you know, the wee folk and all that stuff. Yeah. And that episode kind of reminded me a lot. I was, going back and forth thinking about it. But I guess to start off, what made you get into Shapeshifters? What made you decide to dig into that?
Well, I mean, it's one of these issues where, the whole issue of things like werewolves and dogmen and things like that have interested me for a long time. But in saying that, if you're going to write a book, you want to be able to give the reader new information. So I always, whenever I'm coming up with an idea for a book, I always want to sort of put myself in the position of not just a writer, but as a reader and a fan of books as well. So, I always try and look for something new. And so with the Shapeshifters book, rather than just go over old ground and just have like a 250-page book on nothing but werewolves, which are the first thing everybody thinks of when you think of Shapeshifters, I thought, well, why not make the book a bit different and show people some of the more alternative sides of shapeshifting that have nothing to do with werewolves or vampires. So, but although there are sort of 3 or 4 chapters in the book collectively on those topics, I sort of expand much further into things like Men in Black, Black-Eyed Children, the Wendigo, all sorts of weird creatures which allegedly have the ability to sort of shapeshift or morph their appearance into something else.
And you definitely have a lot of unique material in it that I've never heard of as far as stories and things like that. But what do you want to tell us about wee folk and fairy type situations?
Well, yeah, I mean, when anybody talks about fairies today, in the 21st century, it's inevitable that people think of kind of like little figures with wings flying around the Christmas tree or whatever. That's the sort of image that people have of fairies today. But if you go back sort of 400 or 500 years back to sort of Middle Ages era England, fairies in Ireland and Scotland and Wales, what you would find then, the fairies were very, very different to that image that people have today, from looking at Christmas cards or whatever. They were sort of 2 to 3 foot tall, very sinister, dwarfish creatures that would lurk and live under old mounds and in ancient tunnels under the ground. And they could be sort of friendly, malevolent, benevolent, trickster-like, manipulative, and they were extremely sort of weird and sinister little creatures. And there are a lot of stories about how supposedly, these little goblin-type creatures could allegedly change their form into everything from like a ball of light, like a ball of energy, to other types of creatures, black cats and black dogs, which England has a long tradition of sort of ghostly phantom black dogs. And so that, there's this long-standing legend, if you like, of how the fairies could take on these various mysterious forms. And it's only really been the last couple of centuries that the whole angle of a fairy being like this little, sort of tiny princess with wings, it's very different. Probably the best example I can think of for people who might want to learn more about the sort of the real angles of fairies that, as they were sort of born and created hundreds of years ago. There's a film called The New Daughter. Now, it stars Kevin Costner, and I'm not a big fan of Kevin Costner at all, really. But what I would say that the movie, The New Daughter, is a really good one, and it's without giving the story away, it's about these primitive little creatures that live deep underground, and I'll kind of leave it at that. But if you watch that film, The New Daughter, with Kevin Costner, that really gives a good indication of what the real angle that created the legends of fairies is all about. But I said I include a chapter in that because, as I said, there are legends of the fairies being able to turn into large black cats, black dogs, balls of light, all sorts of weird things.
I've seen that movie. It was really good. It was definitely a surprise.
Yeah, it's not a bad film.
Yeah, it was a surprise.
Funnily enough, the girl who plays New Daughter, she's actually the same girl who's in the Pan's Labyrinth movie, which also has a bit of shape-shifting attached to it as well.
Okay. And it was weird because in that lore episode, it kind of made, like, the way they were all acting, the Irish people with the girl was kind of like a demon epidemic. Like, if you replace the word fairy with demon, it would be like religious fanatics freaking out, the exorcist type thing. It was very similar. So, I mean, I do believe these type of beings exist, but I find it fascinating during those times how, like, for instance, in that episode, they were about to do a lynch mob and get this girl because a fairy was inside of her and they were going to kill her. So I'm sure that caused a lot of, situations back in the day, too.
That kind of demonstrates, how different society is from then to now. Back in England, where I'm from, just up to like 300 years ago, they were still burning people for being a witch, literally tying them to a post and setting them on fire. Today you'd spend the rest of your life in prison for doing that, or put to death. But 300 years ago, it's like, oh yeah, she's a witch, just set her on fire. Yeah. So it shows how cultures have changed a lot in the last few years.
They could get away with it and it was legal. They do it.
Yeah, what a way to go.
But I keep thinking of Robin Williams in The Fisher King when he's on the toilet and sees the little chubby fat fairy people during his movement. But of course, I've gotten into the subject of the UFO phenomenon and fairies as well. There's a very similar weird connection with that I know you're familiar with, no doubt about it. And I just saw that documentary. I noticed Stan Gordon was in your book. And I've had Stan on the show and have interviewed.
Oh, yeah, Stan's a good guy. Yeah.
Loves me some Stan Gordon. Yeah. But I just saw that Invasion of Chestnut Ridge, and it's like the most I've seen Stan in anything. It was great. Small Town Monsters. They did that documentary Invasion of Chestnut Ridge. But so, in what capacity was Stan in your book?
Well, I mean, Stan is someone whose work, I've been interested in for years, when I was way back in my 20s, and Stan's someone who, when it comes to things like Bigfoot, where I share a lot of beliefs with Stan, that I do believe there's a genuine Bigfoot phenomenon, but I'm not convinced that it's just like a North American equivalent of an African gorilla or anything like that. I think there's a lot more weirder to Bigfoot than that. Bigfoot is so elusive. We never catch them. They seem kind of impervious to bullets. They vanish in a flash of light. People report psychic connections with them and UFO encounters in connection with Bigfoot. So I think there's far more going on. Now, in relation to shapeshifting, one of the things I talk about in the book is an area of Texas where I live just outside Dallas, but the further you go towards East Texas, when you're sort of bordering towards Louisiana, there's a large area of forest not too far from the city of Houston called the Big Thicket. Now, it's a gigantic area of forest land, and there's a road that runs through the Big Thicket that's known as, the title is Bragg Road, that's its official title, but the locals refer to it as Ghost Road and as Ghost Light Road, because people see these strange balls of light flitting through the woods, kind of like these similar balls of light people have reported in like the Brown Mountains in North Carolina. You have the Brown Mountain lights, you have the Martha lights also of Texas. And in the Big Thicket, they have these balls of light that, as I said, look just like a ball of light the size of a tennis ball up to about like a beach ball and anywhere in between. Now, there are a number of people who claim to have seen Bigfoot-type creatures in the Big Thicket and have said that the creature kind of shape-shifted into one of these energy balls and vice versa, the energy ball transformed into like a Bigfoot, which has sort of given rise to the theory in some parts, the idea that Bigfoot is more of like rather than a flesh and blood animal, it's more of like an energy-based creature that can take on multiple forms by altering its energy state, if you like, which is, controversial. But there are, there's more than a few reports of these sort of weird morphings in the Big Thicket of creatures to a ball of light and vice versa as well.
It's interesting you say that because a long time ago, when I was 17, I had testicular cancer and went through chemo, and I'm fine now. I've been healed forever, and I rarely get sick at all. But a year or so later, my father passed away, and I was like, well, why is all this crap happening to me? So I started reading everything I could get my hands on, from the Bible to the Satanic Bible to Simon's paperback Necronomicon to Druidism to just everything, trying to seek and learn stuff. And, I started to have a lot of UFO stuff happen to where I would see UFOs at every house that I moved to with multiple witnesses, and friends were like, Jeffrey, you're attracting them here. And I don't think I've ever been abducted or anything. If I have, I've been completely mind-wiped because I don't remember anything. But I've had many incidents to where they've been at treetop level, and it seemed like they were focused on like they were there for me. And that was a lot for me to deal with, just to imagine that some weird thing in the sky's here because of me. But one of the things that the UFO sightings have kind of calmed down. I have some once in a while, but nothing like my golden oldies. But one of the things that I see a lot now, which it sounds goofy to say, I see beings of light. I've seen them many times. And from this house in Florida, one day I went several years ago, I went out to my yard and I looked up towards my house, and I saw two people made out of light leave my house and fly into the heavens, like they just were stopping by, and they were leaving, and it was like this two, and you knew that they came out of my house, like they were so low, it was like they just went through the ceiling and were leaving. Well, since I saw that, I've talked about it forever. I can't shut up about it. And I've asked many different guests about what they think they are, and I've heard extraterrestrial, angels, us without our bodies. But I remember Don Oscar, who's been on the show from Sounds True, and he said that down in South America, they would meet at particular times of the day and watch the shining ones in the sky. And there's another feller on, I'm having trouble recalling his name, from Inner Traditions, another medicine man, and he said that the dead can travel in spheres of light. So I guess I've kind of summed it up to what I've seen. I don't know for sure, but I guess us without our bodies is kind of what I'm going with. And for a time, I thought maybe I was about to die, and I was like seeing into the afterlife, and that's why I was seeing them. But I've seen them all around the planet. I've seen them leave the house, and I've talked to medicine men about them and stuff. And when you were talking about the balls of light, I don't know if that's the dead, the things that these phenomena that happen at different sites, but I know the medicine man told me that the dead can travel in balls of light. So I've always thought that was interesting. But as far as beams of light and stuff like that, what's your perception on that? Are they considered shapeshifters? And also, I know you have a chapter about blinded by the light, and I guess that goes with our light subject. But I'm kind of curious what you think about the beams of light, and then the chapter blinded by the light.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is what I talked about, sort of wanting to do a book on shapeshifters, but that was a bit alternative, where instead of sort of typical image that people have of a guy bursting out of his clothes at the full moon and, growing fur and fangs and killing a bunch of kids in the woods or whatever, that's the image people have. But that kind of angle's been covered so many times in books. That's why I wanted to do a bit different. So, the idea of shape-shifting involving something like a Bigfoot shape-shifting into a ball of light and vice versa, it's still shape-shifting, but it's kind of like a new, refreshing angle for people who want to learn more about it. But yeah, I think that there's no doubt in my mind that there's a connection, with these sort of strange lights and creatures that can take on multiple forms. I mean, you mentioned the chapter Blinding by the Light. This actually deals with something that's quite rare, and that's a government file dealing with shapeshifters. It's actually a British military file that I found at the National Archives in England, which is kind of like the US Archives over here. And the file talks about an incident in the early 1960s in a little village in the south of England called Avebury. And Avebury is in the county of Wiltshire, where every year, we have most of the crop circles, and a lot of the crop circles appear just on the fringes of this little village called Avebury. Avebury is sort of known for the fact that it's surrounded by this huge stone circle. Now, it's not like Stonehenge, where the stones are like gigantic stones, it's sort of 20, 25 feet high. They're sort of about 6 or 7 feet high in Avebury, but they're sort of a wider circumference. And the story in the file talks about a woman how she's walking around the stones. She was actually a resident of Avebury, but walking around the stones late one night, which she liked to do, and she saw this ball of light. And as it got closer, sort of about 10 feet in front of her and about a foot or two above her, there was something very similar to like a camera flash, which briefly sort of, blinded her until her eyes got used to it. And this ball of light, she said, morphed into like about a 6-foot-long writhing worm-type creature on the ground. And not surprisingly, she sort of like ran for her life, phoned the police, who thought it was a prank, and basically warned her not to waste, the emergency service lines, etc. But then she contacted her local Air Force base, and interestingly enough, they took it seriously and sent out a couple of guys to interview and prepare a lengthy document, which has now been declassified. And it talks about how they interviewed her, and it was actually taken really seriously, to the point where the team itself was from an arm of the British Royal Air Force called the Provost and Security Services, and they're kind of like the James Bonds of the British military. So they took this case very seriously, and it's sort of unique in the sense that it's sort of got UFO overtones attached to it with the ball of light, but then it's also got shapeshifter angles with the fact that she said this ball of light morphed into this kind of strange, large worm-like creature, not unlike, if you've seen the Tremors movies, something like that, but scaled down a little bit, but similar.
That is weird. And then
Yeah,
I've heard
very weird story.
The balls of light making crop circles and weird connections with that too.
Yeah, that's actually something I talk about in the book as well. A chapter on how shapeshifters tie in with crop circles. One case that I talk about in the book actually involves a friend of mine named Matthew Williams, a Welshman who actually lives in Wiltshire now, where most of the circles appear. Now, back in the 1990s, Matthew was out in one particular field where a crop circle had been made the night before, and he was basically staying out in the field to see if anything else weird happened. And of course, in Wiltshire, there's a lot of countryside and there's not much illumination, so you get out into these fields and it's sort of, it's pitch black. And Matthew saw these three balls of light come like in unison together, like in a triangle pattern, towards the crop circle formation, and then hovered over one particular side of it and then dropped to the ground. Now, within seconds of these lights hitting the ground, Matthew said, there was suddenly this growling noise in the circle and a sound that sounded like the corn was being crunched down and pushed down in the various areas that weren't already pushed down. And Matthew sort of backed away quietly, as silently as he could, out of the field, got in his car and drove off. Now, this growling and sort of heavy padding of feet or paws on the ground is interesting because there are actually a few stories where people have said they've seen like large black cats in English crop circles. In England, we call them ABCs or alien big cats. They look like sort of the classic image of what people term as like a black panther. But there are a lot of weird aspects associated with these large black cats in the UK that kind of push them in a paranormal path. But a guy named Marcus Matthews wrote a book a couple of years ago called Big Cats in Britain, and he's got reports too of these black cats seen in crop circles. And the fact that, as I said, Matthews' encounter involved seeing these three balls of light which hit the ground, and then suddenly there was this weird animalistic growling. So, you could make a case that again, there's kind of a very similar shape-shifting from a ball of light to this, on this occasion, into like a large black cat.
Definitely very fascinating for sure. And let's get Jay on the horn here. And Dan, if you want to ask some of Dan's questions. But we got Dan from Atlanta spazzing out in the chat room with questions. So we're trying
I haven't been able to get into the chat room. It's making me make a download on it, and my computer's slower than hell, so I haven't seen any of those questions. But I do have a good question about this is a brilliant theory that you came up with, and I'd like to hear you talk about how you came up with it. Chapter 13, Aliens That Probably Aren't, you propose that maybe some alien abduction encounters aren't with aliens from another planet, but from shape-shifting Earth creatures. And that's a fascinating idea because I have never heard that one before. If you can expand a little bit about that, how you spoke about it in the book and how you came up with that idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, this in a way also ties in with these balls of light. Now, everybody involved or interested in UFOs has heard of alien abductees. But if you go back to the 1950s, you had what were known as the contactees. Now, the big difference is the abductees were people taken against their will on board UFOs, and the typical scenario of medical experiments and missing time and memories wiped out, that kind of thing. But as I said, back in the 50s, you had the contactees, who were people who claimed face-to-face contact with very human-looking aliens. And a lot of these stories, admittedly, are very controversial. Came from people like George Adamski, George Van Tassel, Truman Bethlehem. Now, one of them was a guy named Orfeo Angelucci, who wrote a number of books, including probably his most well-known one was called The Sons of the Sun. And he said that on every occasion that he would meet his contactee-based entities, which are known as the Space Brothers, and they were described as very human-looking but with long hair, which wasn't the normal fashion, for guys in the 50s. But he said that on every occasion that he felt compelled to go out and speak to them. It was almost like he was driven to go out to one specific place, which was an old bridge in Los Angeles, where he would, like a very shadowy old bridge, and he would park the car up, and he would just feel compelled to go there for no real understanding why. And he said as well that these balls of light would suddenly appear on the horizon in the darkness, slowly approach the lower level of the bridge where he'd parked underneath, and suddenly these balls of light would transform into these so-called space brothers, these human-looking alleged alien creatures. And there would be these sort of philosophical discussions of, threats of nuclear war and how we needed to change our ways, etc. But although they identified themselves as extraterrestrials, Angelucci was someone who was well versed in mythology and history and folklore, and he'd actually realized that these entities transforming for a ball of light actually tied in with these older stories we talked about earlier of fairies being able to turn into balls of light. And over time, Angelucci began to wonder if the so-called space brothers were actually aliens after all, or were they something that was kind of resident to planet Earth, but that was kind of masquerading, if you like, or presenting itself as extraterrestrial as a means to get a message across of don't destroy the planet, because they shared the planet with us as well, which kind of would make sense, that, I always wonder if aliens from millions of light years away, why would they be so concerned about our planet? But if they actually are from here and they're forced to share the planet with us, the last thing they want to do is have this violent species called the human race destroy the planet if they're part of it as well. So, Angelucci had some interesting concepts and ideas about the changing of these balls of light to the space brothers, and pondering on the idea that all along they may actually have been here.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't considered that. Why would an alien race be concerned how we, deal with our own politics? Whether we drop a nuclear bomb on one of our enemies. I always found that fascinating. Why would they care? And the explanation that I've heard, I didn't necessarily agree with. People have said that aliens felt that the nuclear weapons we drop here had some kind of effect on space where they are there millions of light years away. And I don't know how that's possible, but maybe it is. Yeah, the explanation has never sat well with me, so that makes more sense. That they'd be more concerned.
It kind of. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It kind of ties in with the theories of the late Mactonis, who coined this term, the cryptoterrestrials, the idea of ancient races that came before ours that may still live in stealth on our planet, but which sort of stay in the shadows for the most part, and may even present themselves as alien as a means to hide their true origins, and so it's kind of like a unique but interesting theory, the idea that the UFO phenomenon might be terrestrial, but they're trying to present themselves as extraterrestrial so we don't find out exactly what they really are. So.
Yeah, and I've had that idea for a long, long time that, if you extrapolate from the Bible, and let's just say for argument's sake, and I know this isn't true, but let's just say for argument's sake that this planet is the only planet in the whole universe that can create life, and we did find alien life, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that they came from here millions, perhaps billions of years ago. This planet's 4 billion years old. It's very, very possible that one or more or even dozens of other species have gotten to our level of technology or beyond and left the planet. So it makes absolute sense that some of them are actual terrestrials.
Yeah, you're right. We always kind of think we're the sort of the top species on the planet. But if you think about it, if there are other animals or creatures or entities on our planet which are sort of more paranormally, supernaturally based, then it's possible that, they're far in advance of us, but in ways that we don't understand. I mean, you look at these stories of Bigfoot dematerializing and popping up somewhere else. Well, we can't do that. So maybe some of these things are far more advanced than us, but in very different ways. Maybe they're not driving cars and using iPhones, etc., but they have the ability to perform certain skills, if you like, that just way beyond us,
superhuman powers, basically flight and super strength, that kind of thing. I believe that is true as well because of there are so many stories. I mean, shapeshifters hit every culture on the planet. They're in all kinds of forms, and you got a bunch of them in your book. I mean, I don't know if you mentioned Rakshasas in there, but they're sort of the Indian version of shapeshifter werewolves. You mentioned werewolves. You talk about vampires in your book, and so there has to be something to that. There can't be that many stories of shape-shifting creatures without some sort of real seen item.
Well, actually, that's a really good point you bring up about the fact that there are tales of shapeshifters all across the planet and all throughout history, and particularly when a lot of these countries and cultures weren't in touch with each other because of massive distances, and yet they all have stories of creatures that could alter their forms, or a human could change into this or could change into that. And, you've got the typical werewolf angle of somebody turns into a wolf-like creature. But then, you have the Native American legends of things like the skinwalker, which could take on multiple forms. The Wendigo of like Alaska and northern parts of Canada, this cannibalistic humanoid type creature that could take on various forms as well. So, you have legends like this all around the world. And I think when so many of these nations thousands of years ago had no way to be in touch with each other, and yet they're telling very similar stories, that's an important pointer, in this whole issue. But, I mean, the term shapeshifter can mean many different things, and it goes beyond just, as I said, things like the Underworld movies or American Werewolf in London,
Yeah. And did you find that this is also true, that any shapeshifter, that they seem to all have a root form? Like when they're not imitating some other creature, they have a root form that they can be recognized by. Do all shape-shifting type creatures have that same thing? Did you find that across all cultures and stories?
Not in all of them, but I mean, a lot of them do start out in like a human or a somewhat human form. I mean, when I say somewhat, is because in some cases they look human, but it's like human-ish. I'll explain what I mean by that. I've got one chapter in the book on black-eyed children stories. Now, for people who aren't aware of the whole black-eyed children phenomenon, they're called the black-eyed children because their eyes are, totally black. Not just the second part of the eye black, the entire eye in the white of the eye is black. And, they're sort of described as being pale and skinny and about 12 to 14 years old. They wear these black hoodies and they knock on people's doors late at night and try and find a way into the home. We're lost, we're homeless, we're hungry. Can we come in and have some food, or can we come in and you can phone our parents? And they find every way they can to get into the house, but they always have to be invited. And that's kind of like with the old vampire legends. Of course, in the old legends, vampires were shapeshifters as well. Now, there's a lot of parallels between the black-eyed children and the men in black. Both of them dress in black. Both of them come out at night, knock on the doors, and try and find a way in. Now, in terms of shapeshifters, I've got a really, really weird story, even by my standards, in the book, of a woman who, of all places, lived and still lives in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is where the Mothman was seen in the 60s. Now, the story that she gave to me, she was actually a shift worker, got home late one Saturday night, was sort of crashed out on the couch watching a bit of TV about 11 o'clock, and there was this loud knock on the front door. Now, of course, like most people, if a door, there's a knock on the door and a really loud one at 11 o'clock at night, you're going to think, who the hell's that, So she went to the door shut the door kind of tentatively, looked through the spy hole, and there were these two black-eyed kids. And now, at the time, she didn't know about the black-eyed children phenomenon. She just described them as wearing black hoodies, and they were talking to her, saying, can we come in? But they were looking down at their feet. And with hindsight afterwards, when she searched all this on the net and realized that she'd seen one of these black-eyed kids, she thought that, with hindsight, that they were looking down at the feet so that she wouldn't see their eyes too much. They'd be kind of camouflaged. But at one point, one of them looked up and said, "Can we come in?" Or will you let us in, I should say, more of, demanding an invite. And suddenly she saw these solid black eyes and, sort of had this fear go right through her. And from there, this is where it gets really weird. She said, as she looked at these two kids, it was kind of like, when you get a heat haze, if you're driving the car on the highway in the, middle of July or whatever, and you see like a heat haze on the road and it gets sort of blurry and, but it's just down to like a heat haze. But it was kind of like that, she said, that these two kids took on like a blurry heat haze kind of appearance. And she said, and she came across really down to earth, incredible, telling what was an incredible story. She said that they morphed into like two, what I can only describe as like 7 foot to 8 foot tall reptilian type creatures, and then suddenly vanished. They'd literally gone.
Wow.
Cases like that are so, I mean, granted they're rare, but they're also like very, what I call like rogue cases, in the sense that they're, the kind of thing you don't hear that much. But what happened was I spoke at the 2014 Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant in 2014. And, because it's an outsider event, and it's, there are literally thousands of people turn up, a lot of people come to speak to the speakers, whether they want a picture or a book signed or whatever. And we had a chat. I had a chat with this girl, and she told me this story, and it was like a fascinating account of, involving the black-eyed children, but it just happened to revolve around black-eyed children who turned into these sort of upright lizard-type creatures. So, again, this takes us far away from the whole werewolf type of shape-shifting, but by the same token, it is shape-shifting.
So do you think are there actual, in your opinion, creatures that actually their form does shape change, or do you think maybe it's a technology, maybe it's a 3D technology like the hologram kind of thing, and they can make themselves appear to you different, but to our untrained eyes it looks like shape shifting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think in some cases these things can present themselves in different ways. In other words, we see them in different ways based upon their ability to affect our minds. So that could have been the case with this girl, Alison, the idea that, with the black-eyed children, I think there's a very good chance that they did not physically shape-shift, but they shifted from the perspective of the witness. In other words, it could have been like a holographic type change, or it could have been some sort of mind control that led the witness to think she was seeing them changing, but they actually didn't. So, there's a different angle there to shape-shifting. But in saying that, there are some cases where people have stated, they've seen things that have literally shape-shifted. And now this sort of brings us back to the more traditional angle of werewolf-type shape-shifting. One of the cases I talk about in the book was one that I was actually able to investigate personally last year, and it revolved around sightings of a werewolf-type creature back in 1972 in the Ohio town of Defiance, or city, I should say. It's a small city called Defiance in Ohio. Now, a friend of mine, Ken Gerhard, put on last year what was called the first Dogman Symposium. And Ken put it on in Defiance because there was this really weird spate of werewolf sightings in Defiance in the summer of 72. A lot of the sightings, or most of the sightings, began on an old set of railroad tracks that run through Defiance. And they're still there today. The area actually hasn't changed at all. And a lot of the guys, were working shifts and reported seeing this upright wolf-like creature, but it was wearing what looked like tattered clothes. So in other words, this was like a classic example of somebody allegedly sort of, bursting out of their clothes and taking on the form of a werewolf. Now, you would imagine if it was just a hoax, the guys, wouldn't have said anything, or they'd just, just played prank on their friends, but they didn't. They actually went to the local police and the press, the local media in Defiance, told them what they'd seen. And the press were on it immediately. You know, if you Google Defiance Werewolf 1972, you'll actually find, you know, the word for word statements, you know, the newspaper articles from that time. And the local police opened an official file on these werewolf sightings, almost like a real X-file, if you like. And from there, you know, everything kind of exploded, and the entire town of Defiance was sort of overwhelmed by this werewolf hysteria, and people talked about hearing its howlings in the middle of the night and scratchings on people's doors, etc., etc. And then after about 2 months, it suddenly came to a complete end, and the sightings were gone. There was no sort of weird cries in the night, nothing. It was just a case of, you know, here 1 minute, gone the next minute. But although it's very little known, this particular story, the legend, or these events of the Defiance werewolf in Ohio, for 2 months or thereabouts in Defiance itself, I mean, it was major news, and all across Ohio, you know, various little local newspapers were commenting on this. But that's one of the few cases on record in, I know it's 45 years ago, but you know, in relatively recent times, this is one of the few cases we've got where multiple people talked about some sort of creature that actually did seem to shapeshift.
Wow, I have never heard of that. And my dad actually is from Ohio.
Well, if you look, as I said, if you look up Defiance, Ohio, werewolf, 1972, that's all you need to put in, and you'll see all the different stories that have been told about it.
Yeah, I've got a few here. I'm going to have to look at them after the show. But yeah, fascinating. So you mentioned, and I was going to bring that up as a follow-up question, that mind control also might have something to do with it. So I don't know if you actually qualified an answer with the question I had for you. Do you actually think there are creatures that shapeshift, or do you think it's pure lore? I tend to think that they do, but I'd like to know your real opinion on that.
Yeah. I think for the most part, the shape-shifting relates to things like holograms, mind control, these things having the ability to make us see them in different ways. So they're not those. It is shape-shifting, but it's like a mind-based shape-shifting. Now, things like the Defiance werewolf, that does sound more like a physical shape-shift. Now, today, you know, the term werewolf today has largely been replaced by another term, which is dogmen or dogman, which is kind of like a politically correct version of the word werewolf. Because a lot of people, you know, you mention werewolves today, people roll their eyes if you say you believe in werewolves. But a lot of people report these creatures that have become known as dogmen. And a good friend of mine, Linda Godfrey, has written like 6 books on the subject. You know, that shows how many reports there are. Now, what's interesting about these dogman reports is that there are a number of cases where people have seen these so-called dogmen walking on 4 legs, like a gigantic wolf, looking just like a wolf, but much larger than normal. And then when they happen to cross paths with people, they rear up on their hind legs. Now, we're not talking about rearing up like a bear will do briefly on its hind legs, or, you know, if you've got a pet dog, you can teach it to walk along on its back legs for a couple of steps, you know. We're not talking about...
And they're really wobbly,
Yeah, and they're really wobbly. But people have talked about seeing these dogmen, and that apparently they, you know, most of the witnesses say that when they stand up on their hind legs, it literally is like their back legs change to where they become more like human legs, allowing them to run at high speed and not kind of, you know, sort of balance like a dog would, or, you know, walk like a bear can, but just for short distances. These things can sort of run at high speed and, you know, just like an Olympic runner. So I actually do think with the dogman angle that there really is a physical transformation taking place, but there must be, I think, sort of a supernatural overtone to it that actually allows for the manipulation and alteration of bone, flesh, muscle in a way that we just really don't understand, you know.
And it could be a higher function of the brain. We have no idea of knowing. But, you know, people, these things tend, in my opinion, to flow with people's opinions. And, you know, if you don't believe in shape-shifting, I believe it because of one creature, and that creature is the octopus. it appears to be shapeless, but it has shape and it can take other forms and it can take on any color on the rainbow with its skin. So it's a fascinating creature and can take on many shapes. So it is, in my opinion, a shapeshifter and a real one.
Well, you've also got things like, the chameleon. The chameleon can change its colors, and you can find some insects which actually, over time, this isn't shape-shifting, but over time, they have developed so they actually look like twigs and leaves. They can blend in with the background. So, there is an aspect to this which is genuine and based around regular nature and biology as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's definite biological evidence for it, but I didn't hear about shape-shifting aliens from other planets until within maybe the last decade or so. And I've kind of been, sort of researching UFOs and aliens since I was about 11, 10 years old. Not really, like a professional researcher, but I have been looking at it for, decades. And I have plenty of books on it and videos and DVDs, documentaries.
Oh, cool.
Never have heard of alien shapeshifters in like the real life aliens that I've been looking at. Now you've seen them on Star Trek and they've been on other shows, Beyond, Outer Limits and those kind of things. But it seems to me that once they were when Star Trek actually put a shapeshifter in the Star Trek movie and they came out in other sci-fi shows, that you start hearing about it in the UFO community. Same thing with the Stargate. I had never heard of a Stargate type of technology until the show came on, and you didn't hear about the technology in the UFO field at all until within, again, the last few decades with Stargate coming out. Do you find that some of these kinds of trends kind of flow with popular TV and entertainment?
Well, I think, I know for sure that what happens sometimes is that if something becomes popular on TV or movies, like take for example the Men in Black mystery, I've got a lot of cases where people said to me that, I had a Man in Black encounter, but I never thought of what it actually was until I saw the Men in Black movies, and then I realized that's what I saw. That's basically what they said. So I think sometimes what happens is that people have a really weird experience, but they don't realize that there's actually reality to it until they see it in popular culture, and then they think, wow, that's actually what I saw. And then they feel more comfortable about talking about it when they realize that they're not the only person. So I think that happens a lot, where somebody talks about something and then the story gets out into the public domain, and then more people feel it's okay to talk about it because they're not alone. So I think sometimes movies and TV shows don't create the reports, but they prompt people to come forward because they feel more, like I said, comfortable about speaking about their experiences.
Hey guys, hey Jay, we got to go on break. We're gonna take a break. Hey Nick, what's your website before we go on break? You want to give out a link?
It's my blog's called it's called World of Whatever, and the address is nickredfern40 FORTEAN.blogspot.com.
All right, everybody, you're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Also, check out our UPRN YouTube channels, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, or United Public Radio. It's one of those, or all of those. Go check them out. We'll be back very shortly. Taking a break. Welcome back to the Church of Mavis radio show, 8:10 p.m. Central. Just later I'm going to watch. There's a show called, I want to plug it because it's such a good show. It's on IFC. It's called Stand Against Evil. And if you like Ash versus Evil Dead and all that, it's kind of like that. It's pretty good. But it just started the second season called Stand Against Evil. It's got John C. McGinley in it. He was on Scrubs. I'll just read a little description. Stars in the comedy horror series, the sour, judgmental sheriff Stan Miller, who is forced to give up his job because of an angry outburst at a most inopportune moment, his wife's funeral. But anyway, it's Stand Against Evil. It's on IFC. It's on the second season. They're just like 30 minutes apiece, but like last season, he had to fight a goat man. So there's like all kinds of creatures in it. It's really good. If you like, I'm horror comedy. I don't really like horror that's realistic, like Hostel, for example. That was okay, but it was too real. I like horror comedy with, creatures and stuff. Good stuff. Gotta have the comedy. I like it mixed up. Well, let's get back to Nick. I guess, Nick, if you could, I'd like to get into two topics. We'll start the horrors of Hexham, and then I'd like to, after that, get more into the Native American connection.
Okay. Well, yeah, the chapter in the book, The Horrors of Hexham, funnily enough, that actually revolves around an incident that occurred in the same year as the Defiance werewolf sightings in Ohio, 1972. But this was actually in the north of England, and what happened was that two young boys in this little town of Hexham in the north of England were digging in their backyard, just playing, as kids do, and they unearthed these two stone heads, one of which looked male and one seemed to look like a female type face. And they didn't know what they were. They were just sort of cool little carvings that somebody had made fashioned them into these heads. Now, when they were taken into the family home that night, a lot of weird stuff began to happen, like poltergeist activity, the people waking up in the middle of the night and feeling a sense of a dangerous presence in the room. And the heads actually caught the attention of the local press. The local newspapers commented on it and wrote articles on it. And this caught the attention of a woman named Dr. Annie Ross. And she was an expert in sort of ancient British history and folklore. And she believed that these two heads that the kids had unearthed were actually Celtic heads going back thousands of years, and which had been used in perhaps sort of fertility rites or sort of rituals to ancient earth gods to try and ensure a good harvest next year for food and things like that. Now, at one point, Dr. Ross was actually given access to these heads, and she took them to her home to study them. And she talked about how on the night that the heads were given to her, she woke up in the early hours of the morning to see this sort of humanoid figure covered in hair with a head and face like a German shepherd looming over the bed. And she screamed, and then the creature supposedly jumped over the banister in the staircase and bounded out the front door. And she had experiences with this creature on several occasions, and the Hexham heads, as they became known, were shared with various researchers over the years, and nearly all of them reported getting like a really creepy and weird vibe from these heads, these carved ancient heads. Now today, nobody knows where the originals are. A few copies were made for, so people could show them at conferences and things like that as to what they look like. But the original heads have gone missing. We don't know where they are. But what's interesting, as I said, is that just about everybody who handled them experienced weird supernatural activity in the home, and also reported seeing these manifestations of these almost phantom-like werewolf-type creatures.
Definitely an interesting story there for sure. I've always enjoyed the Native American stuff. Anytime I can find info about that or have somebody on, and it's not easy to do. I mean, there's some people out there, but not to, it's hard sometimes as far as, finding the topic. I had already Six Killer Clark on several times and interviewed her several times, written and on the show, and I definitely love her angle of everything. But as far as your research, and I know in the book you get into skinwalkers and the Native American connection and a bunch of different stuff, but one thing that I found really interesting that you got into was Coyote, the trickster. I've always had a weird connection to those stories and that energy. And I have this quilt the two Native American women who were on the show made me, and it's on my wall that they painted Coyote on it. I'm just kind of curious, do you think there's a connection? Yeah, they made it and gave it to me, and I hung it up. And I'm just kind of curious, when it comes to the Skinwalker and Coyote and the Dog Man, I mean, what's the connection that you see there? Is that like all the same archetype? How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because there's no doubt that, if you look at Native American history and legend and folklore, it's dominated by various different types of shapeshifters. Now, there's various theories onto, in relation to what the skinwalkers actually are. Now, some people take the view that they're sort of like a witch-type entity that can take on animal form. And typically the forms that the skinwalker can take on include, for example, birds, bears, and even coyotes, which gets it kind of confusing, because the coyote itself is said to be a shape-shifting trickster, but the skinwalker can also turn into a coyote. So, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. But one of the primary creatures or animals that the skinwalker can turn into is that of a giant wolf. Now, there are a lot of reports from Native American reservations of people seeing gigantic wolves, far bigger than any kind of regular wolf. Now, probably the best example, if you've seen or read the book Hunt for the Skinwalker by Colm Kelleher and George Knapp, which came out about 15 years ago, that talks about the so-called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, where there's been a lot of weird activity going on. And people describe seeing these gigantic wolf-type animals that like the size of a pony. And one of the sort of deep beliefs was that this was like a skinwalker prowling around. Now, on this angle of, the skinwalker being able to turn into wolves, etc., back in 2010, I did a TV show, and it involved two brothers named Real and Chance. They were rappers, and they had like a short-lived paranormal show. And I did an episode with them out in the California desert near the town of Joshua Tree, where there'd been some weird animal mutilations, which the local people, and some of who were Native Americans, believed were the activities of a skinwalker. So we went out there for about 4 or 5 days, maybe a week, I forget now. And we spent a lot of time speaking with Native American people in the area who believed these attacks were caused by the skinwalkers. And what was interesting was that, they were interviewed and filmed for the show, but one of the people we spoke to, a woman who was well versed in looking after wolves, she actually had a wolf sanctuary. She was happy to talk about, or fairly happy to talk about the skinwalkers, but she wouldn't use the word skinwalker. She felt that actually even mentioning the word could kind of open like a door or portal that would cause her endless sort of negativity and problems. So, this was 2010, so it demonstrates how these ancient beliefs are still very much in place today. But with the coyote, the legends are they can turn into sort of fish, birds, wolves, even in human form. They're not so much malevolent; they're more tricksterish. The trickster is a creature that supposedly just enjoys manipulating people and putting them in bizarre and weird situations, rather than being actually something that's definitively dangerous. But the skinwalker is sort of very different,
Yeah, and Coyote does that and then laughs about it. Like there's always a big joke.
Yeah, it's like poking. It's just let's screw with the locals, that kind of thing.
Do you think coyote is very, I guess you would consider the Norse Loki the trickster? Are they very similar? I mean, obviously there's differences, but it's also that same trickster energy. I'm kind of curious, from your own perspective, how would you describe Loki as if you were doing a coyote, as you just do a coyote? What do you think about that Loki?
Oh, well, I would actually describe it as almost identical, at least in terms of the way it interacts with us, which is, like I said, in a very tricksterish, manipulative way. But I mean, you could look at, the trickster, the coyote, Loki, even the ancient fairy stories where, the fairies would take on different appearances and they would enchant men and, lead them into the woods, and they'd be taken to the fairy kingdom where they'd meet this beautiful princess, and then suddenly she'd be out of reach and gone. It was just a case of, you can find stories like this everywhere where these shapeshifters don't do damage, but they just enjoy tinkering with us and, pulling our strings, so to speak. And again, like I said early in the show, when you find, you've got the stories of Loki, one of the more well-known Norse gods of Scandinavia, but then you've got the same kind of stories coming out of England 500 years ago. You've got Native American tales of similar creatures, and no evidence that these different races and cultures met each other back then, and yet the stories are extremely similar. So I think, we are looking at a real phenomenon, whether it's, it's in the guise of a wolf or a coyote type creature, or, even like a Scandinavian god. It all comes down to a very similar phenomenon.
I got a question from Dan in Atlanta, and this question is, Nick, in your opinion, could these shape-shifting creature theories be a main source for the unexplained and unsolved missing 411 cases chronicled by David, Paulides? Do you think there's any connection to that or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, I mean, regardless of how you look at it, I mean, thousands of people go missing every year. And we know, also that a lot of people every year go missing in national parks and massive forests. Now, I'm sure in some cases, people who aren't sort of used to spending time out in the wilderness, they fall off a cliff edge or whatever, they bust a leg and they can't get back, and they die in the woods, or they get attacked by mountain lions or grizzly bears. I'm sure that's a part of it, but there are a lot of weird stories, really weird stories of people encountering Bigfoot, and stories of Bigfoot taking people away into the woods, whether to eat them or kill them or whatever. But there's a lot of stories like that. Now, you look at these accounts like David Paulides has put together and other researchers, and, you get this kind of really sort of unsettling, creepy angle or imagery of creatures like Bigfoot sort of lurking in the woods, and when perhaps, food supplies are down, they go hunting for us. We think we're sort of the top predator or the top creature on the planet. That may not be the case. It may be that we just don't think of ourselves as the victim, as the prey. We kind of view ourselves as the predator, but that may not be the case at all. So yeah, I think these stories of people going missing under really weird circumstances and where Bigfoot type creatures are being seen. I think there's more to this than people realise, and I sometimes wonder, you hear these stories about government conspiracies surrounding Bigfoot. I wonder if the government knows something about this. Maybe they have some records on file of really bizarre killings and that seem to have been done by, these creatures. So, I do think, there could be some aspect to it along those lines.
I know there's that Mount St. Helens Bigfoot story. I think talked to Tom Powell. I always mess up his name. Tom Powell about that. PHOEM.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
I wrote about that in one of my earlier books called Monster Files. For people who don't know, the story is that in 1980, when Mount St. Helens in Washington State exploded, or basically erupted, I should say, after sort of weeks and weeks of threatening to erupt. It literally, I mean, when the mountain itself erupted, it created blasts that just flattened entire areas for 30 or 40 miles, and dozens of people were killed, and a lot of animals, were injured and killed well. And although most of the people took the military's advice and basically got the hell out of Dodge, there were, for the animals, it was more a case of the emergency services went in to help, like the local populations of like bear, deer, and all the different animals. You had the military, the Air Force, the Army coming in with emergency services to get the animals out of the area as well, because the forests were on fire, etc. And there are rumours that when the military went out to Mount St. Helens, to help with the animal populations, that they actually found a number of injured and burned Bigfoot. And the story is that they were sort of airlifted out by double rotor helicopters and taken to military installations where they were sort of, helped try and get their health back, and but then studied as well. And it's not unlike the stories of, for example, dead aliens found at Roswell and the military whisking the bodies away. It's kind of a similar situation with them finding these living and dead bodies, and and hiding the truth and trying to figure out what these things were or are. So the Mount St. Helens Bigfoot phenomenon is a really interesting story, which has aspects of cryptozoology attached to it, but also aspects of the paranormal and the conspiratorial as well.
Definitely. It's definitely a very interesting story, no doubt. There's a book I just got off of Lyle Blackburn's site. He was selling it, and I guess he had to stop for some reason. He was getting rid of them. But The Lake Worth Monster of Greer Island, Fort Worth, Texas, by Sally Ann Clark. And one thing that I found really interesting about it was on the front, Bigfoot looks like tan. I mean, it looks like tan.
What was the reason for that?
I'm definitely curious to what you think about it. I'm a Capricorn, so I have a weird pan thing going on all the time. So
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the case you're talking about is actually only about a 20-mile drive from where I live. I live just outside Dallas, Texas, and the area where Lake Worth is only, like I said, about a 20-mile drive from where I live. Now, what happened was that back in the late 1960s, began in 69, there were sightings of this strange hair-covered creature in and around Lake Worth. Now, Lake Worth is the name of the town, but it's also the name of this huge lake in the town as well, so it gets a little bit complicated. But people reported seeing around the lake this hair-covered creature late at night roaming around, and it became known as Goat Man, because some of the witnesses said that although it looked, if you look at it today, superficially it looked kind of like a Bigfoot type creature, but some people said it had protrusions coming from its head that kind of gave it like a goat-like appearance, and so it was given the name locally as the Goat Man. That's how it became known. And funny enough, the first person to actually write about the Goat Man in the local newspapers was the late Jim Mars, conspiracy theorist, who died just a few months ago.
Yeah,
and Jim was working for the local newspapers at the time, and he wrote a story for the Fort Worth local newspaper. And a number of people came forward, claimed to see this creature, and the police, local police, opened a file. But the creature it wasn't so much a shapeshifter, but it had aspects of animals and humans, where it had a humanoid type body, but it had this sort of goatish-like appearance as well. Other people described it as having hoofs rather than feet. So very weird, and it went on for a couple of months and then suddenly came to an end. But Sally Ann Clark, who you mentioned, she was the first person, in fact I think the only person, to write a full-length book on the Lake Worth monster, as it became known, or the Goat Man. And her book is sort of like a semi-fictional story. What she did, she spent a lot of time interviewing the real witnesses, but what she did was to turn her investigation into like a semi-fictional novel, but based on the reality of the cases. And the book, the book sold well, and you can still find copies all over the place right now, even though it's sort of almost 50 years old. And it's an interesting, cool book because, as I said, it presents the facts, but it does it in sort of speculative fiction way, kind of like fact mixed with fiction, if you like.
Yeah, it's definitely. I'm glad I picked it up. It's kind of a rare find for sure. Yeah. And that's why I thought about too. I've seen weird like old Bible pictures where some of the characters from the Bible are like hairy. There was some weird blog that had all these weird pictures of like medieval paintings. It's gone now. I can't remember the name of it, but it was like had all these medieval paintings, and in them were like hairy people in Bible scenes. But it's some definite weird with that, no doubt about it. But a weird story that I'm debating if I should tell it, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway because I've told it before. And then I'll hand it over to Jay. My weird Pan thing, the story goes from what I've read with Pan and Capricorn is Pan was caught pleasuring himself by the gods, and they punished him and put him in the Nile River and gave him a serpentine fish tail as punishment for the dark unconscious. I know I've read that at sites all over the place, but I don't know the root of that or if that came from like Greece. I don't know where it came from. But it's weird because I think I've had to deal with that Pan archetype energy because when I was 17, I was caught pleasuring myself at home by a family member, and a kid told the entire school. And I had like teachers would walk up to me and try to shake my hand and move their hand away, like to make fun of me. So, and a year later, I got testicular cancer. And it's just weird that story with Capricorn and that happened to me. It's just strange. I wonder, am I Pan?
I've not heard that story about Egypt at all, but no.
Yeah, I'll have to find the source of it about the whole Capricorn story. But there's weird Pan stuff, so that's why I find it fascinating. And also I wonder, the creatures that are Pan, what are they, satyrs, very earthly. I mean, I've just wondered about the tie-in with Bigfoot. I mean, they seem like similar creatures, aren't they, on some level?
Well, they are in the sense that certainly the creature that was seen over at Lake Worth was described as being like an upright humanoid type creature covered in hair. But it was also described as being slightly scaly as well, which is odd. But the only reason the main reason it became associated with these stories of goat men was because the Lake Worth monster, as I said, had these strange protrusions coming out of its head. Now, they weren't sort of pointed ears, like a German Shepherd dog. They looked kind of like, almost like horns, not big horns, but big enough to actually see them. So it's kind of inevitable, that this imagery and name of the goat man would develop,
Definitely, no doubt about it. All right, well, Jay, come on, step up to the mic.
All right, I actually got a couple on mechanics. So shapeshifters, the ability, is it defensive? Is it offensive? Is it a combination of both or neither? What is your opinion on that?
I think it's a cross between defensive and offensive. And what I mean by that, it's kind of, say, for example, you see a large bird sometimes, you get too close to them, they'll sort of, suddenly their wings will open up, not because they're about to take off into the sky, but because they do that as like an intimidation kind of thing. And I think it's kind of the same thing when you see, rams butting heads together, that kind of thing. You find a lot of animals will sort of, display sort of wings and, things like this as a means of intimidation. So I do sometimes wonder if the whole process of shape-shifting is kind to intimidate the person, to terrify the person. It's a similar, it's a parallel to the peacock that opens its wings wide, when a person gets too close or whatever. So.
And if you are a shapeshifter, you're limited to your mass and volume. So say you're 4'2" shapeshifter, you're not going to be able to transform yourself into somebody that's 10, 15 feet tall. So there's got to be some mechanics as to your natural shape and volume. You're limited to what shapes you can make out of that mass. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think you can look at it two ways. Either these things are so weird and energy-based that they can literally take on any form, or, as you said, they're limited. I think it has to be one or the other. But, I mean, what I would say is that, you could make an argument that there are multiple different types of shapeshifters, but which can only take on certain forms, or there's just one archetypal kind of shapeshifter, and it's responsible for all these different phenomena, and either scenario is kind of intriguing and amazing. It's just I think the problem is, our science is so different to the science that relates to them. We're very much sort of involved in physical technology, iPhones, laptops, iPads, cars, you name it. Whereas their science, I think, is very more sort of almost magical, compared to ours. It's very different in nature, and I think that's why we're still struggling to understand how these creatures can act in the way they do, the powers they have. Our science has, leapt forward in leaps and bounds, but in a very different way to their kind of science, if you like.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you. I think it was Stephen Hawking that said it best when he's talking about alien creatures, even certain creatures that are on our planet they're not alien, but they're just so foreign to us that our minds can't grasp them. And I think what he said was, in essence, that if we go out searching for alien life, we might find something that is so alien that we might not even recognize it as life. So, I don't think that's the case with the shape-shifting creatures. But there are probably some creatures out there that we can't recognize as sentient or living creature because they change shape. They're amorphous. Not so much the octopus type of creature, but like a sponge in the ocean. It's a creature, but it has really little no shape.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a couple of good examples as well. I mean, if you look at, for example, in the oceans, like the electric eel. Now, an electric eel can literally, send out an electric current to electrocute someone. I mean, that's kind of like almost beyond our ability to understand how a living creature could electrocute another one. So that's a perfect example of how nature has created a creature that is so far beyond us to where it's almost, we just cannot understand it. And I mean, another example, take a thing that everybody's seen, a spider's web. A spider is a little tiny creature, and yet can you imagine any one of us successfully ever making a spider's web? We can't do it. But this little creature, a couple of inches wide, can create this intricately patterned web. And I don't care how long with me or you try to do it, we would not be able to replicate that at all. So in other words, nature has created animals that are so weird and strange and have such skills that are so different to ours. They're not, as we see ourselves, the top dog, so to speak, but they are far more advanced to us, but in very different ways. And I think that ties in with the shapeshifters, that, there are aspects to their reality, if you like, that we just do not understand. In the same way, if you were to present an iPhone to somebody 300 years ago and, you open up a YouTube image of a talking dog, they would just be like, their jaws would drop to the floor,
You'd be burned at the post as a witch.
you actually would. You'd be there
yeah.
to the post and doused in the equivalent of gasoline, and see ya. You know.
And I have to agree with you with the aspect of how certain creatures are advanced in us in other ways, in biological ways. I mean, I don't care how old you are now or how old you get, and no matter how young you are now starting off. You walk into a spider's web, that substance is so foreign to us, you always go icky, icky, icky when you walk through it. I mean, you can't help but cringe. No matter how, even if you love spiders, you walk through an unseen spider web, your immediate gut reaction is to immediately freak out and get goose pimply.
Yeah, and you could find that, in all sorts of different animals. I think sometimes we think animals are our, inferiors. They're not. I mean, you look at any animal, so like, a dog, a mother gives birth to the pups. Instantly, the mother knows what to do, to clean the animal up and then feed it. It's like it's primed into their memory and their mind. And and we very often we don't give animals the justification and that they deserve in terms of how they are like you said, so many ways, in advance of us, and also more importantly in ways that we just don't fully understand, like homing pigeons. You can send a pigeon off hundreds of miles and it'll come back to where it left, where it lives. And, a lot of studies are being done suggesting it's done through magnetism or, following ley lines even on the planet. We still don't really know how it's done, but I mean, you or me, we couldn't kind of just, get dumped 200 miles away and then find our way back home by walking. It's like good luck with doing that. But a pigeon can do it by flying, So, but it's our ego, that makes us think we know everything that there is to know. But in reality, we're just one of many creatures that share the planet with us,
Yeah, we're just kind of flopping along here, but my biggest question that I like to ask people in the UFO community, and it kind of ties in with your book a little bit, because there are some alien aspects to the shape-shifting thing. I heard many, many years ago, probably in the late 70s, 78, 79, that during the first run of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry was back in the studios on the back lots of Paramount in his office getting ready to start writing for season 2 of Star Trek, and he was approached by the alien-type Men in Black creatures, and they told him that they liked his show, they thought it was great, but he was close but wrong. And if you remember, in the first season, the Enterprise is under the United Earth Space Probe Agency, not the United Federation of Planets. And these two gentlemen told him about a galactic federation that had some 80-some planets and 120 races, and that folded into Star Trek from seasons 2 and 3 and beyond. And I was wondering if you had ever heard of that rumor that Gene Roddenberry was given information about our galactic neighborhood by some of our galactic alien friends.
I haven't heard that story, but what I would say, there are a number of stories out there of, people who, like, for example, H.P. Lovecraft, one of the sort of most famous and greatest horror writers ever. But, there's this sort of school of thought that when, a lot of Lovecraft's concepts and ideas for, strange creatures that he talked about in his novels and his short stories, there's this school of thought that believes that because he had a lot of these experiences that led to his novels in his dreams, some researchers believe that he actually wasn't dreaming, that he was sort of opening a portal, if you like, in his mind to other dimensions and realms. So in other words, he was, you can make a kind of similar case with Gene Roddenberry, the idea that it seemed as if the person was creating these concepts and these ideas in their mind, but they may actually, like with Lovecraft, possibly have been exposed to a real multi-dimensional world very different to ours. And then he started writing about creatures like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth as fictional creatures, not realizing that he was actually seeing fleeting glimpses of other dimensions in his sleep state. So I think there's enough cases on record, I should say, where sci-fi and horror writers have been inspired what may have been glimpses into other worlds, like Philip K. Dick. He experienced that as well, the idea of seeing in his mind what may have been real events or real other multi-dimensions, which he then incorporated into his sci-fi stories.
Yeah, and they actually bring this up in one of the Ancient Aliens episodes recently. I think this most recent season, where they talk about how other famous minds have done the same thing. Einstein, Tesla, where they've maybe not channeled, but their brain has somehow connected to an internet type of information source, and they're grabbing ideas and inventions out of that.
Yeah, I think they have this sort of almost like a collective mindset where people are knowingly kind of like channeling or mainlining into information and data that's sort of downloaded into them, and they're not even aware that it's, they think it's coming out of their imagination. It may not be. It could be the case that certain phenomena is being literally kind of like downloaded into their mind, their subconscious, and then it comes out in the form of a novel or a TV show or a movie. And maybe sometimes that's done deliberately as a means to kind of upgrade us without realizing that it's an outside force that's doing it. I actually do think with Lovecraft stuff particularly that something was like he was being used as like a vessel to get these ideas and images out there. He just didn't realize that his terrible nightmares he was having were actually projected into his mind, or he was sort of astrally projected into these other realms of existence, maybe.
Yeah, and he's not the first that I've heard of that. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. Jeff's a huge fan of Lovecraft, but there's other guys that have done the same thing, that have downloaded a book, if you will, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he channeled over a number of years in the 20s the Urantia book, which allegedly tells the creation of our part of the galaxy and our solar system. So I think there's some real substance to that. But how much of it do you think might actually be real information coded in our DNA, and then at some point that DNA just somehow leaks out and gets in our brain? Do you think that's part of that same system? It's a separate system? Because I've come across things that I knew. Somehow someone asked me a question and I knew the answer, and I knew I've never been taught that. So I'm thinking it must be some kind of genetic memory.
Well, I think there's something to that. The idea that, within all of us, there's something that's kind of encoded. And you can look at that in various ways. I mean, the one angle would be, that for the most part, there's always one aspect of us that looks kind of like our parents, or grandparents. Whether it's the shape of your nose, your lips, your eyes, there's always something. So in other words, there is something that gets passed through down generations. Now, in saying that, you also get these angles where, so let's say somebody has a heart transplant, and there are cases on record where somebody's had a heart transplant and they've sort of developed a craving for the food that the person who's donated their heart after they were killed or died. It's as if they were picking up some essence of the person. You have another example would be things like, somebody has a dream or a nightmare of some distant event, the distant past. Well, maybe that wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was sort of an encoded memory. I mean, it's like, for example, things like the Great Flood. You can find flood legends all around the world. And they kind of resonate with a lot of people as where you kind of think there's this hazy, almost like a hazy memory of cataclysms in the past, but we can't quite put our fingers on them, but everybody kind of has a hazy memory, if you like, or a thought about that. And it kind of makes me think that within the sort of the human mind, that there really are encoded ancient memories of certain events. If, say, for example, we can be born and have physical characteristics of our parents, like I said, whether it's your lips, your eyes, your nose, whatever, well, why not could fragments of their memories not be downloaded to us as well? And what about their parents and their parents and their grandparents? Maybe that would explain why so many cultures around the world have very similar beliefs, traditions, and ideas, because we're all kind of somehow, linked to some ancient collective memory, even if we're not fully conversant of how it works, etc.
Do you think the Anunnaki story, and it's also in the Bible as well, that how they turned off part of our brain, do you think that's the mechanism they've turned off?
Well, I mean, we can never say for sure, because a lot of the Anunnaki stuff is kind of,
it's fourth dimensional for sure.
It's sort of speculative. But what I would say, I mean, the idea of sort of genetically manipulating an ancient humanoid species, one far earlier than what we are, Homo sapiens, but, you go back not just perhaps Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man, but way back when you had these little 3-foot-tall human ape-like creatures with clubs running around Africa millions of years ago. You could easily understand how genetically you could alter a species and make it, like a slave species or exactly what you want it to be. I mean, you hear a lot of disturbing stories today about how in the very near future we'll be able to create what have become known as designer babies. Oh, you want a baby with blonde hair or black hair, or you want your son to be 6 feet tall and a perfect athlete, or you want your daughter to look like Angelina Jolie or whatever, that kind of thing. That is actually not sci-fi. We're getting down that path now where we could actually create designer children. We're also going down the path where research is being done now into what are known as artificial wombs, where maybe one day in the near future, women won't give birth anymore. Babies will be grown. You look at that. Now, for our perspective in the early 21st century, that sounds like horrible sci-fi scenarios. But for the people of that era, they might look back at us and say, oh, my God, those poor women had to go through 9 months of all that. But for us, it's like it would be a culture shock to be thrown into that world. But for the people of that era, it wouldn't be. Kind of like the same way if you time traveled somebody from the 17th century to here, they'd probably have a heart attack within 2 days because they would not be able to cope with the sheer changes in society. So, I think there is something to the idea that we could have been genetically altered in a way that's kept us, limited to 80 or 90 years, and this sort of this angle of us perhaps being used as a slave race, rather than one that could actually have the ability to sort of rise up against, these ancient aliens, if you like.
All right, and do you think that with these technologies, the genetics that we have coming up, would that give us the type of powers we talked about earlier in the show, like the super strength, maybe even being the ability to change shape? Do you think we have that ability yet, or we will be able to unlock that at some point with the genetics technology?
Well, I don't think we've got it now, but I mean, what I would say, people have talked. One of the areas which ties in a little bit with shapeshifting. A lot of research has been done recently, into sort of splicing the genes of one animal into another. There was a big controversy about this in the UK a few years ago, where scientists were sort of, blending the genes of one animal with another, and they were supposed to destroy the embryos after like 2 or 3 days. And there are rumors that, they didn't. So, this isn't shape-shifted in the sense of like a spontaneous shape-shift, but it's actually splicing the DNA of one animal into another, and one of those other animals just happens to be a human. Now, this could take us down really weird paths where, again, it wouldn't quite be shape-shifting, but imagine if you could create a slave race of like a lower-grade type of human to do all the, the manual work, and that was subservient and that wouldn't ask questions. That, again, goes down a really disturbing path where you have different levels and tiers of humans, the power elite, and this genetically altered version that does all the work nobody else wants to do,
Yeah, and it might even explain some of the fantastic creatures that you brought up in your book and that are in the past, some of those weird hybrid things like chimeras and griffins and all that kind of stuff with, 3 and 4 different animals spliced into one.
Yeah, and also if you look at things like the Minotaur, the Centaur, the Cyclops, you know, like I said at the very early in the show, a lot of legends and tales, folklore, always tend to have some sort of basis in reality at their heart. So, you know, while I don't think, you know, we had literal Cyclopses or, you know, the Minotaur, whatever, I wouldn't be surprised if those tales could actually have been based upon potential ancient gene splicing of different species and creating these sort of freakish animals, you know, by ancient extraterrestrials. I think that's an interesting concept to work with.
Yeah, I think it has to be, and I've said this quite often in other interviews. You know, the ancient alien postulation that we were created by, let's just say the Anunnaki, which is the main culprits there. They wouldn't have just gone with one experiment. They would have cultivated multiple types of experiments with multiple creatures on the planet to find the one that they could, A, talk to in their language, and B, could understand the advanced concepts of whatever they were doing. Mining gold, for example, as Sitchin would have us believe, or mining even fissionable material for them to refuel their nuclear engines and so on. So they would not just make one type of species and run with it. They would be dozens or even hundreds of experiments, and then the ones that petered out would be destroyed, and the ones that showed promise would be brought forward.
Yeah, that's basically what we do. You know, if an experiment in it doesn't matter what the area is, physics, chemistry, biology, you know, if we investigate something, we launch an experiment, it goes nowhere, we look at other options, you know, and I think because we're the sort of the good, superior human race, we're the top race, you know, top creature on the planet, we think or assume that, you know, we couldn't be used in the way that we use animals, etc. Or, you know, we couldn't be used in experiments. Why not? Well, because we're people, you know, we're the top thing. But, you know, that's just our ego. You know, for other races, we could just be the equivalent of an ant, and they'll do with us whatever they want to do. And, you know, I think that's quite plausible as well. But people just don't think of it like that. They're like, well, there's no way we could be the slaves or the, you know, the manipulated animals, and well, but why not? You know, why should we be any different to anything else? You know.
Right, I absolutely have to agree with you on that. And I've thought about this. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm waiting for Joe to give the signal, and we should be closing out very soon. So just letting you know, I'm waiting for Joe to give the flag.
All right. Well, let's see if we can get this one in. If not, then we'll close it out. But it seems to me that, and I've lost my train of thought. What was the last thing you were just saying, Nick?
Just, you know, where we think we're sort of the top creature when we actually, may just, compared to other races, we may be just way down on the level, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Now I've got my train of thought back. So it dawns on me that if there are ancient alien creatures out there watching our planet, and the rumors say that it's true, and we don't have any evidence yet, but if there are aliens out there watching our planet, it's been said that some are evil, some are good, some are on our side, some are not, and some are indifferent. And it's the indifferent species that scare me. They keep calling us the big experiment, and by us, I mean the aliens call us that. And it's the indifferent ones that, you know, how indifferent are you and I to a fly or an ant? You know, if it bothers us, we'd have no hesitation to just wipe it off of existence. And the indifferent aliens would absolutely feel the same way about us, and our big egos, as you said, wouldn't let us think that, oh yeah, they could turn us into slaves or food or just destroy us outright.
Yeah, and I think we don't think of it that much. You know, if aliens are coming to the Earth, we think, oh well, it's got to be to see us, you know, because we're the great human race, and they would want to show themselves to us and learn from us. Well, I don't think they can learn much from us. We're not the greatest species on the planet, you know. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can learn from, you know, the relationship that we might have with aliens. We can probably learn a lot from our relationship with animals, you know. And if we think carefully about it, how we sometimes treat certain animals, and then we think, well, maybe they could be doing that to us, then that kind of really does make you think as to how high or low we are, you know, in the greater scheme of things in the universe. Yeah,
think about how wonderful our planet would be if we could think, what would it...
got to end it. We're supposed to end 5 till, so I mean, I'm at 59 here. I got to start doing the closeout.
Okay.
All right, guys.
Well, Nick, really appreciate it, and we look forward to you in March with Slenderman Mysteries, and have you back on the show for that for sure. So thanks so much. It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.
All right. Take care. All right, everybody. All right, everybody. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. Coming up next, Supernatural Substation. And I think Joe has been kidnapped and taken by a Yeti. 9 o'clock.
Yeti.
And usually he's pretty stern on the 5-minute thing.
I know. Yeti.
All right, everybody. Good night. You just close us out. Bye-bye.
Good night.
I need to eat and go.
Are we ready to open next month?
I think so.
You think so?
Well, it's complicated. Fire protection, first aid supplies, uniforms, safety training, mat services, oh, and restroom supplies.
So uncomplicated. Call Cintas. They'll handle all of it.
Wow, one company can handle all that? That's not very complicated.
So, you'll be ready?
Oh, we'll be ready.
Oh, I'm ready!
Learn how Cintas can help you get ready for the workday. Visit Cintas.com.